Hey everyone, welcome to the Darshan Talks live stream to the Darshan Talks interview. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help you trust the products you depend on. As you know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA regulated products. So if you think about drugs, wonder about medical devices, or obsess over pharmacy, this is the interview, this is the podcast, this is the live stream for you. I do have to emphasize that I am an attorney, but I'm not your attorney. So this is not legal advice. I am a pharmacist, but I'm not your pharmacist. So this is not clinical advice. I do these interviews because they're a lot of fun. I get to talk to someone like my guest today who is incredibly smart, and I find myself learning something new every single time. So it'd be great to know if someone's actually listening. If you like what you hear, please leave a comment, please subscribe. If you want to ask our guest questions, please feel free to do so. Leave a comment, and I can see them and I can sort of interact with them. And after the talk or during the talk, please feel free to share the video. I do have to emphasize that what we're discussing are considerations. They are not necessarily the opinions of either my guest or myself or our employers. These are just fun, interesting conversations to have. If you want to reach me, you can find me on Twitter at DarshanTalks. Go to our website at DarshanTalks.com, or you can engage me as a lawyer at KulkarniLawFirm.com. Today's live stream is going to be really interesting. We've had our guest on a few times already. He's a regular, he's an expert, and we bring him on every single time because he tells us something new, interesting, and different that we hadn't quite considered before. I'm really excited to hear a little bit about today's discussion because he's been talking about planning, which really excites me because as weird as it sounds, everyone's already talking 2022. So we're going to talk a little bit about 2022, but I really want to ask him questions about something he mentioned right before we got on, which is patient recruitment. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm really excited to discover more about it. I do want to emphasize our guest today is the executive director of the Heart Valve Voice US, and he is incredibly smart. Our guest for today, John Lewis. Hey, John, how are you?
Hello, Darshan. I'm great. How are you?
I am good. I get to see you in what I imagine is a very 1970s. What's the word for it? A mid-century modern. Is that
Correct.
fair?
This is our beach box house built in 1978, which explains the wood paneling. We are in the midst of remodeling room by room to bring it up to date. We actually had our electrician in this morning for some work, so yes, it's a slow process, but
It is, but it looks
we're getting
fun. And I'll be honest, I actually have a penchant for mid-century modern looks, so it just has me interested. So let's start a little bit about how we're all just over 2021 already. I thought 2020 would be the worst year, and I'm not sure I'm necessarily wrong on that one yet. But 2021 wasn't that much better in terms of just how difficult it was. I think from a business standpoint, for a lot of people, these were banner years, which is great. But I'm curious, what was it like as a nonprofit in these years?
Well, 2020 was certainly more disrupted because we did not really, no one anticipated going into the pandemic and the shutdown beginning, mid-March 2020. And we may have had plans in place for the year and had to set those aside, had to pivot. It was difficult for many nonprofits and patient advocacy organizations because if you were depending on certain funding streams or grants, they may or may not have happened depending on the priorities and frankly the financial condition of those funders. We fortunately did not have that issue, but many nonprofits did. Going into 2021, it was, while we knew the pandemic would still be with us, we didn't know for how long. We didn't know when the vaccines would become available or if they would become available in 2021. But we were at least able to plan in in the COVID environment, and we were able to pivot some of our campaigns to messaging that was particularly relevant to our patient population during the pandemic, um, uh, explaining to them, encouraging them to stay in touch with their caregivers to reschedule appointments or procedures that may have been sidetracked or delayed or canceled because of hospital capacity issues and restrictions on elective surgeries. As we've gone through the year, that has, I think the healthcare system, um, about as well as it could, has adopted. We've kind of gone to where there's not just a blanket ban on so-called elective procedures. And as we've talked about before, we're not sure any heart valve procedure is really ever elective. It's not something people do for fun. So it's, but we've seen, while we saw volumes drop a lot in terms of procedures in 2020 and early 21, we've seen those come back to, if not normal levels, close to normal levels. And of course, that has implications for the patients who are not being treated. But at least we're able to plan and message accordingly. And our fundraising went fairly well, probably not as well as we would have liked. And it will be interesting to see, hopefully, if we return to something close to a normal or post-pandemic environment in 2022, how that may affect our ability to raise funds. So those are some of the things we've observed. It's been certainly not easy. You've got to be flexible. You've got to be adaptable. This is any business. I saw a great article the other day about how car dealers are adapting, and they're customizing vehicles, and they're putting more emphasis on service. Although it's difficult to get parts, my car's in the shop now, probably for 3 weeks awaiting parts. But so but every industry has to think about that. And when you're dealing with patient advocacy, it's very important, especially with a population like ours tends to be older, tends to have maybe many conditions in addition to heart valve disease. So it's important to keep their spirits up, to keep them informed as best we can about access and availability and policies that are designed to help them, because we want them to get the best care that is possible under the conditions we have.
So you talk about the struggles you've had, and I think we can explore that a lot more. But before we get into that, I'm curious: what have been the opportunities that COVID has created for someone like for an organization like yours?
Well, I would put that in two categories. One is, as I mentioned, it's the ability to kind of pivot our messaging and pivot our campaigns to incorporate the messages that are most relevant to COVID. To our campaign was Just Go, encouraging people, especially when the vaccines became available. And as we know, the older population has had a much better uptake on vaccines than the younger population, to re-engage in their care and keep that going. So it's pivoting that messaging and keeping that on track, and the ability to really communicate on a topic that's top of mind for everyone, and keep the patients engaged. So that was, I don't want to call that an opportunity, because we wish it never had happened. And there were, in planning campaigns, we would plan for the duration of the campaign and then had to extend and extend and extend, and there may be another tweaks coming here at the end of the year. So, and that's something that, on one hand, from a purely business standpoint, you look at funding, you look at planning, you look at messaging, the different tactics you can use, whether it's social media or video or community building, whatever they may be. And in this case, we wanted the campaign to end. We want the campaign to end. We want it to be over. We want to move on to something else. But that was that situation. I think that the second lesson is, or at least takeaway for us, is we'd been exploring, and we had built an educational program for patients to get involved in research advocacy. And we have evolved that to look more at the role that we can play as Heart Valve Voice in research, whether that is something like a patient preference study, and I'd love to talk more about the opportunities there, which is kind of a more evolving field, or directly involved in recruiting patients for clinical trials. That COVID put a real uh, halt on a lot of clinical research, a real backup on a lot of clinical trials. But now, moving forward, there's that opportunity to get these going again, so we can get new technologies and new drugs into the pipeline, so they can become options for patients. So that's an area we've really started to explore much more this year, and have some really exciting possibilities going on next year.
Do you think that that is cutting edge? And the reason I'm asking this question is I've heard people talk about this a lot, the idea of patients having their voice, patients being advocates for their health, patients being involved in research, advocacy, all that good stuff. Um, when you actually talk to patient advocacy groups on the ground, it's less common. So do you think that there's a big disconnect between what researchers think is happening versus what's actually happening on the ground? And how do you sort of bridge that gap?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think part of the issue there is a tendency to misunderstand and confuse some terms. So there's a concept of uh, patient-focused drug development, or patient-focused device development, medical product development, where you are taking the patient's um, thoughts and wishes and considerations into the design of your clinical trials, into the outcomes of the clinical trials, making sure your inclusion exclusion criteria are realistic, so you can get patients to participate and engage them. So that's at kind of the front end. Then there are patient-reported outcomes, which may occur during the clinical trial process or in clinical care, where the patients are explaining their conditions in ways that may not have been considered, or not initially quantified in the research, or in the initial introduction of the products in the market. Then there are patient preferences that kind of filter all the way through this, and that's a really an emerging area. And I think that may be a bit more. I don't know if I want to use the term cutting edge, but certainly something that's more newly being explored. And that is, and it's not as simple as, does the patient want choice A or choice B? And it's not always yielding to what the patient preference may be, because the patient, and I'll give you our example in the heart valve space, where a younger patient may be facing 2 or 3 valve procedures over the course of their lifetime. The physician who is treating them, whether a surgeon or an interventional cardiologist, has to plan for that. So the medical professional has to think out 20 or 30 or 40 years of this patient's life. The patient is often may concerned, understandably, with the immediacy. What is going to be best for me today? How can I get back on my feet quicker today? And so all of that has to be balanced in the area of patient preference, and weighed in the area of patient preference. It's something the FDA is very interested in. It's something we are certainly very interested in, having those patient preferences incorporated into everything from clinical trial design to the shared decision making when a patient is getting prepared to undergo their treatment, to choose their treatment pathway, to ultimately reimbursement and insurance payment. So there's many different aspects of that, and we're exploring those right now, mostly on the patient preference side, but certainly we're going to look at patient-reported outcomes and other areas.
So let's talk a little bit about that. You talk about, as I see, 3 major areas that patients might get pulled into, at least from the perspective of the heart valve voice. And what I'm thinking about is study design, patient-reported outcomes, and then reimbursement. Those are the 3 you sort of pointed out. My question for you is that it sounds like you, number one, started from the patient-reported outcomes. Is that correct, or did I misunderstand you?
I think I started with the patient-focused product development, or in the research,
Okay.
in the research design, the clinical trial design.
The study design. Okay. So when you started with the study design, my question is, first of all, how did you decide that's the first place to start? Like was it lowest hanging fruit? Was it opportunistic? How do you, in terms of planning, make those decisions?
Well, I think that is an area that's really evolved over the last 10 years or so. Certainly, somewhat driven by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and we just wrapped up a grant from them, training patient advocates in research, that I alluded to. So that is an important area, and that provides many opportunities. So part of the message there, and part of the message through of any type of patient engagement, is empowering the patient to advocate for themselves, regardless of what that environment may be. So if it's in the design of a clinical trial, if they have an opportunity to be in a focus group or an advisory panel to really represent their view and the broader patient view, if it's before an FDA review panel to represent that, if they have an opportunity before payers to explain why this new treatment may be important to patients that the payers may be missing from an economic standpoint. So there is there is there is all of that. So that is really kind of where it starts. Um, Patient-reported outcomes, the science of that has been around a while. It's not well understood. We don't have great definitions in a lot of areas. We don't have great quality metrics in a lot of areas about what that really means. It continues to evolve, and we want to be involved in that conversation. And then the patient preferences are, again, filter through all of this, and it's a really, as I learn more about it, it's just a fascinating science, and the work to go into quantifying patient preferences. And again, it may not be a choice of A or B, but it may be something along degrees. And how do you work these patient preferences into the overall discussion of what is going to be the best treatment for that individual patient?
So let's start with the beginning. Let's say you've got a potential a study design question that's been raised to you. My question for you is, who's raising this? Is it the medical affairs function? Is it the clinical research function? Is it a combination? How do they know who you are? How do they reach out to you? And who do you engage with for the most part?
Yeah, that's a good question. It could come from the clinical team. It could come from medical affairs. In those organizations that have patient engagement and patient advocacy functions, hopefully they are involved as part of that team that is helping to design that trial to make sure the trial is, and it's an overused term, but patient centric, that it is meeting the needs of the patients. And this is not only saying, okay, what outcomes are going to be important to patients that maybe we weren't measuring, and these may not be purely clinical outcomes, blood pressure, heart rate, what have you, but quality of life measures and things like that that may be important to patients that you can capture in the course of that trial. But it's also looking at that trial protocol and having patients look at that and read over, what is going to be required of the patient to participate in this clinical trial. And you'll have patients say, there's nobody who's going to agree to be in this clinical trial because this is just too burdensome, or this is requiring too much, or the way you've structured your inclusion exclusion criteria, you're going to have a very small pool of patients who will be willing to do this. And it's especially an acute issue in the medical device area, and we're dealing obviously with very sophisticated heart valves and other structural heart type devices where if you commit if as a patient, if you commit to being in that clinical trial, you're going to get an experimental heart valve. And it's not like a drug trial where you can take the drug for a week or a month, and if you're having side effects or it's not working, you can just leave the trial. So it's a big commitment to ask a patient to participate in this type of clinical trial, and it's so important that considerations and their concerns be dealt with upfront as that trial is being designed.
So you're talking about getting patients to commit. Here's my question. First of all, how do you choose the How do you choose the patients? And secondly, how do they agree, especially when something like you just mentioned, the case of a heart valve? That's a big commitment on their part. How do they decide that this is something I want to be involved in?
That's a good question, and I actually think we need more research around that area of how patients make those decisions, and it's something we may be looking into next year as well. And it's from our with our capabilities, and I think what I would call our credibility with our community, we can make patients aware of these trials. We can explain to them the basics of what it means to participate. We don't want to be in any position that looks, coercive or a cheerleader for a particular trial, a particular product, a particular drug. But we do want to make this information available because this may be the device or the drug that will treat them better than something currently on the market, or give them access to something that may potentially be better for them. So that is our role. We have partnered with a firm called Antidote, and a big part of their model is to partner with patient organizations like ours, and Antidote can perform the screening functions for the patient, the questionnaires, the follow-up contact, the connecting them, the informed consent process, connecting them to the research site that is most convenient for them. So our role in this is really the front end outreach, and I will use a marketing term that is not as patient friendly, but that the audience will understand, which is basically lead generation.
So you mentioned you partnered with Antidote. My question for you is, who pays for Antidote? Is it you or is it the sponsor?
It's the sponsor. So we are playing a role in that recruitment, and paid a fee that is, depending on how the trial is structured, a fee for our services.
So you've now got a situation where you're doing the lead generation. The sponsor's paying you a fee. You have a vault of trust that you reach into, and you go, "Here's a potential solution for you as a patient." How do you decide which patients? Do you play a part in choosing the patients at all, or do you sort of create or help create? What's the word I'm looking for? Key opinion patients.
It would vary. So if we are looking at, and I'll separate out like an advisory role where we do and we have played a role in helping a sponsor select participants in focus groups or a participant for an advisory panel, because we know them, we know who's qualified, we know who understands the responsibilities, who may have gone through our training program. So in that role, we play a more consultative role. When we're talking about direct participation in a clinical trial, in an interventional trial, that our job there, our mission there, is to make patients aware, to counsel them appropriately, to never violate that bond of trust, and to encourage them to make the decision that is best for them in consultation with their medical professionals, with their families, etc.
So do you do that using online forums? Do you do that using mailing lists? Twitter chats? Like, how do you engage your constituency, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, right now we use three primary channels, maybe four. So we have a patient list, people who engage with us regularly, and an email list, and so we will engage with them. We have our online patient community, My Valve, My Voice, which is growing about 20% a month, and is increasingly active. And however, most of the patients in that patient community have already been treated, so they may or may not be eligible for another trial. And then the third way is through social media and digital advertising, and that is that's obviously where more expense comes in, where the messaging has to be more targeted, um, and we work through that, and we've proven to be pretty effective there, but generating interest and having a patient go all the way through the process is still very, very difficult.
It's funny. um, as you know, we usually aim for these to be about 15, 20 minutes. I have so many questions about your advisory panel, but we're already at 27 minutes. So I want to be respectful of your time. It definitely sounds like a topic we need to explore the next time you come on, assuming you're still interested in coming on. But
Yes, and I may have more. Hopefully have more to share as we're starting to build out some case examples of how this works.
yeah, I'd actually love to talk to you at some point about a case study and talking a little bit about what that looks like in your case. So we should have that discussion for sure. But what I'd like to do is just to place a thought out there. You talked about advisory panels, and you talked a little bit about the role you play in that. So could you, number one, explain what are advisory panels? Again, which group within pharma is helping, sort of requesting assistance with an advisory panel? Is it medical affairs? Is it sales? Is it reimbursement? Is it all of them? Um, and what part of it do you do?
So the advisory panels play the role I was discussing earlier of reviewing, and one example, probably the primary example, reviewing a trial protocol for its um, to see really how realistic is it for a patient to get involved in this trial. How realistic is it for them to meet the inclusion exclusion criteria? What is the benefit to the patient there? What is the level of effort or inconvenience? What are the outcomes that are being measured that are going to matter to them, whether they're clinical outcomes or lifestyle outcomes? So that's really the role of those advisory panels. Where that comes from, in an organization, in a pharma organization or a medical device company, really depends on how they're structured. But ultimately, it's coming through their clinical research team, and that interest in engaging patients at that level really varies widely from company to company. And of course, we advocate for, and we think it's to everyone's benefit, including the trial sponsor, to engage patients early, to design a protocol that is more friendly for them and easier for them to navigate. Because we know the big problem with clinical trials, in any kind of clinical trial, is recruiting people into the trial. And we see, so many protocols. I shouldn't say so many. We see protocols, and I'll read them and I'll say, nobody's going to volunteer for this trial. I mean, because they've been designed, for this scientific perfection that that is not realistic when you try to get a real patient into it. So it's that is the kind of ongoing challenge and tension, and we wish more organizations uh, had this patient focus, and we're committed to it.
It almost makes me wonder, and no one's done this, but I really wish someone would do a study on the cost of bad clinical trial designs.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like the amount of money you spend in clinical trial agreement amendments, the amount of money you spend in trying to recruit patients who aren't coming, the amount of money you spend in developing something and then redeveloping it, having resources deployed that aren't doing anything because you just had a bad design. Those all need to sort of be put onto paper, and the patient voice is a critical role in deciding what that is.
Yes, that it would be a really, really small upfront cost versus all of the things you just mentioned in the cost of that trial. I mean, if you could recruit for a clinical trial, 30 days sooner, that
Right.
that is that is millions of dollars in
Exactly.
value. So yeah.
Well, as you know, I'm going to ask you four questions. The first question we've been sort of throwing out the whole time, but how can people contact you?
Sure. My email is john@heartvalvevoice-us.org. There it is. I am on Twitter at jlewisdc. That would be the best ways to contact me.
Perfect. My next question, what would you like to ask the audience?
I would like to ask the audience um, to think about whether their organizations have a commitment, have a real commitment to patients. Are they really patient centric as they may claim to be? Do they really design their business around the patient? Or how much of that is real? What can they do better?
I love that question. Here's how I think most organizations will answer that. I think it depends on who you ask. I think the people in clinical research will say we took XYZ steps, therefore we must be patient centric, as opposed to, say, sales, who goes, I have no idea who designed this thing because it has no reflection on usability, as opposed to someone who might be a patient advocate who's assisting that company going, I wouldn't sign up for this study. So I think it depends on who you'd ask. But you're right. I think there's a lot of lip service that's generally given. And that's been the problem with patient centric behavior for at least the last 20 to 30 years. It's a lot of
Sure.
lip service and not enough actual steps forward. And that's not to say that people aren't doing it. It's just not enough. So I think that will be really interesting. So great sort of comment more than a question, but yeah, your point stands. What's something you learned in the last month? So I'll give you an example of something I heard, by the way. One was, did you know an octopus has three hearts?
I did not know that.
I thought that was such a great one.
I did not know that. So from a business opportunity, there's three times the ability to do heart valve replacements in octopus if they have heart valve. I don't know. Sorry, that's where my mind went. The something I learned in the last week was, and we've talked a little bit about this in the past, and this is similar to what we discussed about in patient centricity and sincerity, and we've talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the past. And what I've learned is, and this came through at some parts of our board meeting as well, and as much as we want to commit to addressing these issues, it's not easy. And we really have to, and we don't want to pay lip service to it. We don't want to say, oh, here's our diversity initiative over here. Go to this website and you'll know all you need to know about diversity in clinical trials or diversity in heart valve disease or patient access or what have you. Trying to find the right project, the right message, the right vehicle to get involved, to have an impact, because ultimately we need to have an impact. I want to have an impact, or I'm useless. So how do we have an impact? What is the right vehicle to do that? And that is a difficult process um, to go through. Worth doing, and we're close on some things, but we want to make sure they're the right things.
I have to ask this question. It's not one of the questions I asked, but I'm curious because you mentioned this. According to you, is the job of a good manager that they make an impact, or is the job of a good manager so that it looks so effortless that no one knows that he or she's not even there?
Well, I'm not sure that's contradictory. I think
Huh.
so. I guess it's how boldly you look like you're making an impact, maybe, but you can make an impact and not be loud, as long as you're effective. And there's different parts too. There are times if we're involved in a policy debate that may benefit patients or may harm patients, we're going to be pretty loud and we're going to be out there. I don't know if we'll necessarily be effective, right? You don't know. In day-to-day management and planning and strategy, I think you can be quiet, you can move ahead, and get done what you need to get done.
Very cool. I'm going to ask you one more question. What's something that made you happy in the last week?
I was actually prepared for this question this time. I recently, in the last couple of weeks, bought a new mountain bike, and so going on bike rides um, and upgrading my bike has been a lot of fun for me in the last week and over the last couple of weeks, and I'm looking forward to maybe a ride this afternoon. So, yeah, that's I may be a little old to be getting into this sport, but it's fun.
Oh, that's awesome. So you said you're at the beach. So do you have the mountains near you?
No. So we don't have mountains. So I guess some beaches have mountains. Our beach does not have mountains. We do have some very nice trails though, through
Oh,
wooded trails through nature preserve and forest type. So yeah, so they're not. It's not strictly a mountain, but yes, trail riding.
fair enough. This question that I'm going to ask you next was actually inspired by another guest I had recently because I was blown away by the answer. What's something most people don't know about you?
There's
I love it. These are the ones that
there's
trip people up.
there's a lot people don't know about me. So I you know I on first impression, I appear uh, pretty intense and maybe unfriendly and unapproachable, and I don't hide expressions very well. My wife, who knows me very well, will periodically say to me, "Why do you look like you're going to kill somebody?" And it's really just, and I say, "That's how I look." I mean, it's just me thinking,
You have
and I like,
RBF.
yes, and I like to think I'm a more friendly person than I appear to be at first blush. So if there's anything I'd like, if there's a notion about me I'd like to dispel, maybe turning your question around a little bit, it would be that I'm not approachable, or I'm this super intense person. I am pretty intense, but that's often just me being in thought. It's not
Yeah.
hostility. It's not anger. It's the way I look, and there's not much I can do about it at this point.
Have you heard the term RBF before?
Oh yes, yes, resting bitch face.
Yes.
Yes, and that is that may not quite be it with me, but it's in that realm. Yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough. This was, as always, such a fun conversation. Thank you so much again for being part of this, John. I hope we can have you back soon again. And again, just to remind everyone, how can people reach you?
Email John at heartvalvevoice-us.org. And I should mention it's -US because there are other heart valve voices out there. And at Twitter, at jlewisdc.
Awesome. Thank you again, John. Look forward to having you on again.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure.